Thank you so much, everyone who is watching online, who is in Oxford. Thank you so much to Brandon for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a great honor to be in such amazing company. Very sorry not to be there in person. COVID was a lot more of a struggle than I expected, but very pleased to be able to still join the conversation and explore the aesthetics of scientific experiments. So I'm interested in understanding whether experiments in science can be objects of aesthetic appreciation. And the questions that we're going to think about today is whether we can appreciate an experiment for aesthetic reasons, whether we can find, for instance, an experiment beautiful. What would be the focus of this appreciation? What would it mean to say that an experiment is beautiful? What would we actually focus on? And whether there is any stability in how we appreciate aesthetically. This is exactly leading from where James just left us, arguing that there is dynamicity in how we understand beauty in science, and we see discontinuities in science. So how is this to be understood when we think about experimental practice and how much it has changed historically? So I'm going to start by presenting this distinction here. Well, many ways in which we can appreciate aesthetically an experiment. We can appreciate the phenomena that the experiment reveals to us, the instruments that we are using. We can also think about the performance of the experiment itself as something we appreciate aesthetically. This is particularly prominent in earlier experimental traditions where the experiment was practiced as a performance in front of audiences. We also appreciate design of an experiment, and that will be really important to my argument. The very process of conceptualizing a design and a setup for an experiment is also subject to aesthetic judgment and can be appreciated aesthetically. And finally, the results. So let me just give a few examples of all this to illustrate it. So first, the phenomena. This is just a few examples of the kind of amazing things you can see under a microscope if you're in the lab and doing an experiment, but also the kind of instruments you can see if you are, well, depending on which kind of experimental tradition you're part of. The first to the left and to the right, the third picture are from some instruments that we house here in the University of Cambridge in the History and Philosophy of Science department. And they're very clearly aesthetically very pleasing to look at. They used to be, of course, used. And the experiment in the middle is the pitch drop experiment, which I used to pass by every day on the way to work at the University of Queensland, and that's one of the kind of very public experiments. And it resembles very much the kind of performative experiments that used to be more part of scientific practice. But we can see that the instruments themselves can be very pleasing. And the performance of the experiment can be very much analogous to artistic performance. And here in this famous painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, this is very well illustrated. This is an experiment that was performed with a new instrument, the air pump. And in the early days of the Royal Society, the experiment used to be very much a focal point of appreciation for aesthetic reasons. So it will have audiences where people engage with the experiment and appreciate it, and often appreciate nature as it's revealed to them. And this painting is brilliant because it shows us how many different ways people appreciated aesthetically the experiment, from awe and fascination to even fear and all of the kind of the diversity of aesthetic responses that would have to the fact that this bird is going to die because they're extracting the oxygen from the cylinder. So the performance is aesthetically appreciated here, and the experiment is like an artist in the middle of the painting. But what I have argued in some of my work recently is that these features are kind of like a nice bonus to have, right? So they're visual features that are very kind of easily perceivable to us, but they're not necessary or sufficient to make an experiment aesthetically valuable or to make it beautiful. We're going to talk more about beauty today. What really matters is this very special relationship between how the design delivers a result and the kind of imagination and creativity, ingenuity that is involved in conceiving such an experimental design. So let me illustrate this a little bit more. In one of these famous experiments Foucault's pendulum, we see this really well illustrated. It was an experiment that clearly had some very visually pleasing features. It was basically a brass ball that was hung from a rope in Paris's Pantheon, and people would go to see it. As you can see here, there was always an audience admiring it. Beautiful pendulum swinging around. But what's beautiful about this experiment has nothing to do with that. I mean, okay, very nice that we can see something visually pleasing, but what is really ingenious about it is how simple the experimental design is for the purpose that it had and the significance that it had. The significance is really important. This experiment with this very simple setup shows something very previously disputed, and that was that the Earth rotates around its axis. And the experiment delivered that by simply showing that after some time of this pendulum swinging, the sand underneath, the lines that the ball had made were not aligned with each other. So really important results delivered by a very elegant, very simple design. And this is what I think makes this experiment beautiful. The visual features are kind of secondary to this much more substantial beauty that we find in how the results are delivered by a very, very good design for purpose. Similarly, in biology, we celebrate the Meselson-Stahl experiment because it delivered important results to a really, really important question, and it delivered them in a really ingenious way. So this experiment has received the title of the most beautiful experiment in biology for good reason. As historian Hans-Peter Fischer has argued, there was something really ingenious about how the experimental design was basically set up. Beautiful idea to use basically the method of centrifugation, to use density to study the genetic material through the generations as they did in order to determine how it changed. And there was some simplicity, as historian Frederick Holmes argues, in this setup, in the steps that they followed. So simple, elegant design, but the results that the experiment delivered were also incredibly significant. James Watson, one of the discoverers of the double helix structure of DNA, argued that this experiment was ingenious because it gave a simple answer to a question. We treat this experiment as an example of a crucial experiment in science because it delivers these really important, straightforward, easy results. Right? It's not a messy result. It's really quite clear, speaking in favor of one of the three contenders at the time of how DNA would replicate. Semi-conservatively, the answer was. And Peter Fischer argues against that the experimental results just spoke for themselves. There was no need to replicate them. No further commentary was necessary. And Holmes argued that there was this immediateness about them, that there was a singular historic event. We didn't have to worry to redo these experiments many times. Of course, recognizing that that's quite unusual, but that was one of the aspects that was really valued about how the experiment delivered its results. And what's worthwhile noting here is that so far we have these two experiments as examples of beautiful experiments that clearly delivered an answer to a question and delivered an answer to a question that aligns with expectation. Right, in the first case, we have a demonstration of a phenomenon that was expected. And here we had the selection of a hypothesis among three contenders at the time, aligning against the expectation. Sometimes things don't go like that, though. In science, we have sometimes experimental results that will not align with expectations. So the question is, what happens there? Are they then making the experiment aesthetically disvalued? We can think about the Michelson-Morley experiment as an example of something like this and how it has been praised by scientists as a very beautiful experiment. Albert Einstein himself argued that Michelson was an artist in science, the artist in science, right? Really highly praised for his aesthetic sensibility, who took great pleasure and great joy in the beauty of the experimental setup and the elegance of the method that he employed. And historian Gerald Holton argued again about the ingenuity of just setting up the experiment and building the instruments necessary to achieve the goal of the experiment. Nobody before Michelson was able to imagine and construct an apparatus to measure the second-order effects of the presumed ether drift. He argues that the interferometer was a lovely thing. So what happens in these cases where we have results that don't necessarily align quite with expectation, but are really well set up for purpose? I think we should understand them still as beautiful, but understand the nature of significance in a slightly different way. So by significance of results, we can think about them as going our way when we have a demonstration of a phenomenon or confirmation of discovery. But also sometimes we have these disruptive results that are really productive. Not every null result will be like that. But sometimes, like in this case with the ether, not detecting the ether, actually was what was significant and what was really good about this result, this experiment. And so I've argued that we should really think about this kind of productive disruption as part of being a significant result and that makes an experiment really beautiful, right? The kind of significance it had in revising beliefs, opening conversation, and reconsidering fundamental assumptions that are being made. If an experiment can do something like that, that also should be considered as part of being significant and well made for purpose. So the framework I'm suggesting here argues for the following things: that experiments can elicit aesthetic responses. These can be very pleasing, but sometimes disturbing as well. And that's very analogous to how we appreciate artworks. Not every appreciation of an artwork is pleasing or is simply appreciation of beauty as something that's very easy to process. Sometimes they are disruptive as well. I've argued that the visual features are really nice to have sometimes. They're not essential for us appreciating an experiment as beautiful. The beauty judgments really pertain to how the design and the significance of the results are intertwined and how they reveal ingenuity in the setup of this kind of appropriate design for purpose. And I think I want to kind of go back to what James was arguing just 10 minutes before about the fact that we can change the way we experience beauty in science. Clearly, experimental results and experimental setups today are very different. How we get to our results is very different. We use machines. The setups are very different, very big machines, very big detectors. Nothing to do with the 17th century experimental setups that we see, the tabletop experiments. The experiments look so different. They're practiced so differently. So how can we talk then about having some kind of notion that employs to all of these particular setups? I think thinking about beauty as a functional notion will help to see that we can still praise that kind of relationship between design for purpose, even if we recognize that the setups are very different. So how will we actually materialize a really good design for purpose will definitely be changing depending on the kind of area that we're studying and the kind of setup that is available to us. But this, I think, can maybe unify the different ways in which we practice experimentally. So this is from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the talk.